He was the quiet Beatle, the serene center of the chaos. However, George Harrison's serene grin concealed an injury that never healed. It was brought on by years of animosity, resentment, and a friendship that might never have been completely restored. George Harrison didn't shout. He rarely became upset during conversations. Nevertheless, he brought to the Beatles a silent rage that became more over time. It wasn't noisy. Nobody was aware that it was real. And it had to do with them. When he wasn't, he was serene and devout, yet he harbored a resentment that persisted. The silent loser. In the early 1960s, George Harrison was riding a school bus in Liverpool when he first met Paul McCartney. Because they both like rock and roll and skiffle, they got along. Together, they learned chords and swapped music. McCartney was older, wiser, and more self-assured. George, a timid and gullible person, was drawn to Paul's assurance and later to John Lennon's genius. In 1958, he joined John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, at the age of 15. Lennon first believed he was too young. John loved raunchy so much that McCartney set up a bus audition where George performed the main guitar line. The most well-known band in history was formed as a result of that incident. However, George Harrison entered another person's tale at the beginning. Lennon and McCartney helped to establish the band's reputation early on. Most of the songs were written by them. They came up with the concept. Then George came around. He discovered. He absorbed. For a while, that was plenty. Harrison earned the nickname, Quiet Beatle, when the Beatles gained widespread popularity. His shyness was ridiculed by the media, which contributed to the issue. Those closest to him noticed something more substantial, a man who was beginning to feel sidelined and perhaps choked. He had music in mind. His life became more moral. However, his voice was too frequently muffled in the studio. He offered song suggestions, but they were rejected. When he delivered his guitar arrangements, many didn't believe them. Paul had a knack for taking charge and was constantly striving for perfection. Eventually, he would remark, "He ruined me as a guitar player, not because he was mean, but because I was put down for years on purpose." Lennon and McCartney's partnership was more than just solid, it was an empire within a band. George was left behind as well as excluded. As the group evolved, his situation worsened and his anger increased. Over time, what started out as respect became into rage, and Paul McCartney was the one who exacerbated it. The moment when the studio broke down. George Harrison was tired of simply contributing to the White Album without saying anything when the Beatles began working on it in 1968. He had become more self-assured and more driven as a musician. However, tensions within the studio were rising steadily. The circumstances had shifted. Paul McCartney had assumed a significant role because of his ambition and meticulousness. John Lennon's newfound bond with Yoko Ono was making him less steady. George was also tired of being overlooked. Let It Be's early 1969 sessions revealed the long-standing fissures. The band attempted to rehearse while the cameras were filming, but what they saw was more silent disintegration than collaboration. On tape was a well-known exchange between George and Paul. Harrison was being instructed by Paul on how to play his guitar position in the song, Two of Us. With a cool but sardonic response, George said, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if that's what you want." The tone wasn't snarky. It resembled a white flag that said, "I'm tired of this, but I'm not here to fight you." On the surface, it might have appeared to be a little dispute. However, it marked the end of years of creative suffocation for those present. Later, engineer Glyn Johns, who witnessed the Let It Be meetings, described the atmosphere as very unpleasant. George had grown tired of the creative process being a battlefield. He briefly left the band on January 10, 1969. Even worse was Paul's apparent lack of awareness of the significance of his actions. He was bossy, but not cruel. McCartney had a strategy, and he wanted everyone to follow it, even if it meant suppressing their ideas. There was nothing left for George to do. He rejoined the band a few days later with revised guidelines. After that, he began creating pieces like Something and Here Comes the Sun, which demonstrated his abilities while he was by himself. However, the damage was not repaired. George and Paul's disagreement had deepened and was unavoidable. George had already moved on in certain ways, even though he rejoined the band. When friendship turned cold, in 1970, the Beatles officially split up. For George Harrison, however, the split was deeply personal as well as professional. Harrison was cautiously severing relationships with people, particularly Paul McCartney, while the news was centered on the altercation between John Lennon and Paul. Despite the rehearsed meetings and courteous interviews, George was unable to let go of the resentment that had been accumulating for years. All Things Must Pass, Harrison's debut solo album, was released in 1971. It consisted of songs he had rejected or ignored during his time with the Beatles. His former colleagues knew it was a commercial and creative success. One song in particular caught our attention, Wah Wah. At first hearing, it sounded joyful, but the words were really harsh. The title served as a metaphor for the emotional chaos and annoyance George had to cope with, and many interpreted the song as a barely disguised shot at Paul McCartney's domineering conduct during the group's final years together. The rage didn't stop there. Sue Me, Sue You Blues, was released by Harrison in 1973. This time, it was a scathing song about the legal proceedings that ensued after the split. Despite the fact that the song was about the entire group, it was obvious that McCartney, who had initiated the lawsuit to terminate the Beatles' commercial partnership, was the target of much of his ire. Harrison felt deceived despite having to take that action, not just because of the legal dispute but also because it demonstrated how far they had grown. George never really liked Paul's demeanor, according to Patty Boyd, Harrison's ex-wife. She described how George was so fed up with constantly arguing, especially with Paul, that he would be furious when he arrived home from recording sessions. Her words, "They left each other alone, but I don't think they really loved each other." For a little period, they made an effort to collaborate at work once more. Even in 1994, when the Beatles reunited for the anthology project, old habits returned. George and Paul were still at odds. Paul, who was always kind, would acknowledge that they still annoyed each other in public, and he would roll his eyes at McCartney's ideas in private. The cuts were not entirely better, even after time had gone by. They silenced a guitar. George Harrison had already established a prosperous solo career by the mid-1970s. But the scars from his Beatles days were still very much present, particularly in relation to Paul McCartney. Few people had heard George remark aloud when he told Alan Freeman on the radio in 1975, "I didn't trust myself as a guitar player after spending so many years with Paul. Without him, I can't play the guitar anymore." The message was subtle, crisp, and awful. Coming from a man who played guitar on songs like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, the comment demonstrated how detrimental those years with McCartney had been to his mental well-being. George made no mention of Paul's deliberate actions. He meant that his artistic confidence had been eroded by years of being observed, interrogated, and controlled. Simultaneously, George stated that he would be delighted to rejoin a band with John Lennon, but not with Paul. Paul is a fine bass player, according to him, but he's a bit overpowering at times. When you worked with someone whose need to be flawless frequently meant being in charge, it wasn't an insult, it was just the way things were. Music was not the only thing Harrison was struggling with. The ability to expand or have space was crucial. Additionally, he didn't have much space in the Beatles. He continued to feel that calm, terrible awareness long after the applause had subsided. The cut that wouldn't heal, Lennon-George Harrison's relationship with John Lennon was likely more complex and unpleasant in many ways, but it was simpler to see how furious he was with Paul McCartney. When the Beatles were young, Harrison admired Lennon. John was older than them, braver, and smarter. George considered him to be a teacher as much as a bandmate. Harrison's early works were influenced by Lennon and McCartney, who also encouraged him to experiment with lyrics and structure. However, that intimacy began to wane. George felt emotionally detached from Lennon as he grew increasingly interested in his private life, particularly his relationship with Yoko Ono. Lennon, who had took pride in his friendship with George, began to distance himself from him. McCartney's commanding presence in the studio contrasted with Lennon's lack of interest. He ridiculed Harrison's developing interest in Indian music and religion, sarcastically rather than seriously. I, Me, Mine, George's autobiography from 1980, revealed their true separation. George hardly mentioned Lennon in his more than 400 pages of introspective writing. It wasn't an error, as fans witnessed. The message was conveyed by the stillness itself. Harrison subsequently claimed that the final years they shared were frequently chilly and that John could be really difficult at times. The death of John Lennon in December 1980 left George completely stunned. Even still, his homage lacked sentimentality and affection. Harrison instead expressed his sadness via music. All Those Years Ago was a silent reckoning as well as a tribute. The final years and final phrases. By the end of the 1990s, George Harrison had mostly stepped out of the Beatles' shadow, at least publicly. He had changed from being a teenage musician trying to get on a record. By then, he was a spiritual thinker, a well-known solo artist, and a silent donor to worthy causes. He appeared composed, but the emotional wounds from his time with the Beatles were still there. In response to the question of whether he missed being a member of the Beatles, he responded, "Not with the others, no." It was humorous at first, but it revealed the depth of the cuts. George reunited with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr for the 1994 anthology project. Supporters perceived it as therapeutic, but those present were aware that the old behaviors swiftly returned. George became enraged when Paul gave him instructions. Producer Jeff Lynne said after the fact that George would roll his eyes if Paul was too bossy. In 1997, Harrison was diagnosed with throat cancer. After a period of absence, it returned to his lungs and brain. In 2001, he was asked, "Does Paul still bother you?" in a Yahoo conversation. "Do not scan a friend with a microscopic glass," George cited as an old Victorian saying. "Don't worry him with that, you know what he does wrong." Paul visited him as his condition worsened. Sitting hand in hand, they did something they would never have done as children. Later, Paul remarked, "He was my little brother." I laughed. We discussed meaningless topics. Everything seemed like a dream. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison passed away at a friend's house in Los Angeles, surrounded by his loved ones. His final words, according to Olivia, were straightforward: "Love one another." Even after he passed away, however, the complexity of his relationships persisted. If forgiveness existed, it was silent, partial, and possibly limited to one individual. George Harrison left behind a silent protest, music, and a quest for purpose. Although John had never been the most outspoken Beatle, his silence spoke volumes about his genuine grief. There has been respect over the years. There had been love. However, there had also been resentment. George Harrison would also never be able to forget certain individuals.